Hello and welcome to yet another week of the Rails Dispatch. This week we're going to be talking about upgrading Rails to Rails 3. This week is for people who already have a Rails 2.3 application and they're interested in knowing what they need to do to upgrade to Rails 3. So again, we're going to be talking today about upgrading. We're not going to be talking about starting a brand new Rails 3 app from scratch. We've already covered that in previous weeks. And I want to add that this is somewhat of a rehash of the post that's on the blog, but it might be helpful to watch it in video, or there might be some examples here that are more real life. So one big change in Rails 3 is that instead of specifying your gems using config.gem, you specify them in a gem file. So the first thing that you want to be doing is go through your environment.rb and any of your other files, pull out all the config.gems and put them in a gem file with this gem nokogiri or whatever that you wanted to use. If you had something like this, config.gem nokogiri with a version and a lib, this sometimes trips people up. The correct way of converting that is to use gem nokogiri. You specify the version as a second parameter and lib becomes require. If you have any config.gems in the test environment, development environment, or production environment, you want to pull those out and put them into a group in your gem file. In this case, since you pulled it out of test.rb, you want group test do gem rspec. The second change that we're going to talk about is scripts. Instead of doing script/server, you're going to be doing Rails server, and shortcut for that is rails.s. This shouldn't really have any effect on you except for perhaps your workflow, but you may have some other scripts that use script server, script generate, etc. inside of them, so make sure you update them to use the new commands. The third change here is active record. So you've probably seen this already. Instead of user.findAll and then name equals params name in brackets, it looks like this: user.where name is params name. So that's a small change. The old syntax will continue to work if you want. There's no need to change it yet. One nice thing is that same syntax could be used. This is the old named scope, so name scope red, and then you specify the conditions as a hash. The same syntax for making queries is now usable in scope, so instead of saying name scope, you just say scope, and then you name the scope and you use the same syntax. Again, I'll point out that the old name scope syntax continues to work if you want. Additionally, a named scope that uses a lambda, so named scope colored, and then you provide a lambda. The easiest way to convert this to Rails 3 proper syntax is to use a class method, self.colored, and again, you use the exact same syntax as you would have used before in the query. So that's one of the really nice things about the way scopes work in Rails 3 is that the syntax is always the same no matter what you do. A common thing that people would do with scopes is they would create with scope, and with scope basically just says everything inside of this block should use this particular scope. So here what we're going to do is we're going to say that everything inside of this around filter, which is the action, when it looks for posts, it should find with the conditions of user ID. That scopes any queries for posts with posts that this user has. That same syntax in Rails 3 looks like this. So you still use post.withScope, but instead of making the scope a conditions hash and passing that all in as a hash of hashes, again, you use the exact same syntax that you used before. You can also use any scope that you would have used normally. So with scope just takes a scope, so you could return that from a class method if you would want, or any other way. You could use post.red here or something like that. So pretty much any scope that you could get anywhere in active record could be used with scope. And that's sort of the important bit about all this with Rails 3 is that you want to take all the different ways of doing things in Rails 2.3 that involve scoping, name scopes, with scope, queries themselves, and convert them into this one pattern. And you'll notice that when you go to do that in a non-trivial application, you'll find that it becomes very easy to build better abstractions. So I know when I went back and modified some applications that involved scopes, the actual code became simpler because I was able to shift things around to more natural. The next change is to Rails Metal. So we've gone and made Rails Metal a lot more powerful by making it a big part of how the controller stack normally works. So here's an example of a Rails Metal from a real life case that was floating around on the internet. and here's a case of wanting to do affiliate redirects. And what you can do here is it's just a rack application, so it responds to call, grabs a SQL query that gets everything from affiliate redirects where path is path info from the environment. And then we go and we grab a redirection and we set up the headers ourselves and the response and all of this. In Rails 3, you can inherit directly from Action Controller Metal. And what you do here is we pull in redirection and head because those are two things that we need. And what's important to note here is that while we are pulling in redirection and head, we're not pulling in a couple of dozen other modules that would come from Action Controller Base. And so we're still pretty speedy, pretty much the same speed as doing this manually with a Metal and Rails 2.3, but with all the benefits of the specific modules that we need here. So here we grab the first redirect using active record, and then if we have a redirect, then we just simply redirect to the location. Otherwise, we return a not found, and we return a headers of x cascade equals pass to tell the router that it should continue moving on. And then at the top of the router, we do match star path to redirects index, and that basically says match anything to redirects index, and in the Metal, we tell the router that if it doesn't match, it should continue moving on. The next big change is support for XSS attacks, support for defending against XSS attacks. In Rails 2.3, you would have used H specifically to comment. You would have used H to escape post.body here. In Rails 3, you don't need to do that, and that's because any string that's not explicitly marked as safe will automatically be escaped, so you don't need to worry about H anymore. Rails will automatically handle that for you. There is one gotcha. There's a lot of code floating around that looks like this, where you've built up an HTML string inside of a helper. So I'll say a couple things. First of all, what you really want to do in this case is use a partial. If you have a helper that's building up a lot of HTML, that's a more appropriate use for a template. And if you used a partial like this, everything would work as expected. You wouldn't have any problems. Another way to do it would be to use Rails helpers internally inside of your helper. So instead of making the div tag directly, if you use content tag is a Rails helper, and so we know that all those divs and h1s and uls and lis are safe. So if you use a Rails helper like content tag, you don't have to worry about safety at all. Everything will work as expected. If you really, really need to, you can simply mark this string as HTML safe. There is one more gotcha, though, that I've seen people run into, and that's that if you have something like this, you have a list that takes an array of things, and you start with an empty string, and you keep pushing things onto the string and return, you'll notice that the entire string gets escaped. And that's because the string buffer that you started with is just a plain string, and plain strings are always considered unsafe, even if you push safe things onto them. So what you need to do is you need to start out with a safe buffer, so mark the string as safe, and then as you concatenate things onto that buffer, Rails will determine whether or not those things are safe or not and do the right thing, so it'll escape things that need to be escaped, and then the string that you return will be, since you've used content tag, the li here will be unescaped, and the item will be escaped if it comes from the database, but not if it comes from somewhere else. The next big change is Rails block helpers. And what we have here is a block helper in Rails 2.3. You would simply do sidebar do without a %equals. And then the way that you would implement that is that you would first get the content using something like content tag. You would capture the block, and then you would check to see if the block was called from ERB. If so, you would use the special concat helper. Otherwise, you would simply return the string. Rails 3, you just do %equals instead of the %. So now anything that emits content onto the page uses %equals, including block helpers. And the way that you actually make the helper itself is very simple. You just return a string. So the big change here is that in your template, you need to use %equals, and that's for both your own block helpers and for Rails block helpers. And block helpers themselves are implemented simply by returning strings and don't need to worry about concat anymore. Keep in mind that while you will need to change this pretty soon after upgrading to Rails 3, you don't need to worry about changing it right away. You will get some deprecation warnings, and you can handle them as the time arises, but you don't need to worry about fixing them before upgrading to Rails 3, because %, form 4 without the %= will continue to work in Rails 3 with deprecation notices. The next change is JavaScript helpers. Link to remote in Rails 2.3 becomes link to in Rails 3. Note that you need to provide remote true here, and that we have removed link to remote from Rails core. If you want link to remote to have the same old semantics where it used to spit out JavaScript onto the page, you can install the plugin from the Rails GitHub, and that will keep link to remote working with the old link to remote semantics. But you really do want to upgrade to this, and that will also allow you to use jQuery. So the old link to remote only worked with prototype. The new link to with remote true works with jQuery as well. And if you want to use jQuery, simply all you need to do is replace the rails.js that comes with Rails and is in the JavaScript directory with the rails.js from the jquery-ujs repository in the Rails project. If you're using jRails, it's exactly the same thing. You want to replace link to remote with link to remote true, and you no longer need to use the jRails plugin at all. Basically, jRails has become obsoleted by the new semantics that allow you to simply use a JavaScript file and Rails emits markup. As you can see, there isn't a lot of changes here to your application itself. Most of these things are changes that, while are ideal, you could definitely hold off making them. Things like active record semantics are not changing, at least until Rails 3.2. We're not even marking the old syntax with deprecation quite yet, so feel free to upgrade without making a lot of changes. There's a few things that we've talked about today, but by and large, it should be fine to just go ahead, upgrade, make a few changes to config, a couple of changes to your application, and you should be up and running. Thank you for watching week 7, upgrading to Rails 3. Be sure to come back next week for more content.